If you've ever seen a pneumatic actuator in action, you might wonder what actually controls its movement. The answer is a directional control valve, and when it comes to the double acting actuators, it is a 5x2 directional control valve. So, what do we mean by single acting or double acting? On top, you see a single acting cylinder. Air pressure is applied to just one side of the piston and pushes the rod out. To bring the rod back, it's not enough to just stop the air supply, as the pressurized air needs to be vented. And once the vent is opened, spring force causes the piston to retract. This is a double acting cylinder. Instead of a spring, air is applied to both sides of the piston. When air enters one side and the opposite side is vented, the rod moves forward. Switch the valve's position and it works the other way. Air pushes from the opposite side and the rod retracts. While this setup works, it's not practical to manually switch the airflow every time you want the actuator to move. That's exactly what a 5x2 directional control valve does. It automatically directs air to either side of the piston while venting the opposite side. A 5x2 valve is made up of two main parts, the pilot solenoid and the valve body. The pilot solenoid supplies the pilot air pressure that shifts the spool inside the body. We'll see exactly how that happens in just a moment. The valve body contains a spool with seals that directs the compressed air, and on top of it, a pilot piston that shifts the spool when the solenoid is energized. At the bottom, a spring pushes the spool back to its default position when the solenoid is de-energized. Inside the valve body, there are two internal passages. One directs air to the bottom of the spool, while the other supplies air to the pilot solenoid. Now let's look at the pneumatic circuit diagram, which tells us the valve operation. This position always represents the default state, that is, when the valve is not energized. In this condition, there is no pilot air pressure acting on the spool, so the spring force pushes the spool upward. Port P is the pressure inlet. E1 and E2 are exhaust ports for venting the air, and ports A and B connect to a double acting actuator. In the default state, P is connected to B, while B to E2 is blocked. At the same time, A is connected to E1 and P to A is blocked. In this energized state, spool is shifted down by the pilot air pressure. Now P is connected to A, while A to E1 is blocked. At the same time, B is connected to E2 and P to B is blocked. This shows how the 5x2 valve alternates ports A and B between pressure and exhaust. Let's bring the spool back to its default state and connect the air supply. Air enters through port P and passes to B, and part of it is directed to the bottom of the spool. This pilot pressure, together with the spring force, holds the spool firmly in its default position. The same can be seen in the circuit diagram. The triangle at the bottom represents the pilot air pressure, and the spring symbol shows the return force on the spool. The other passage travels upward through the top cover to the pilot solenoid. The air is blocked until the solenoid is energized. When energized, the solenoid plunger lifts and air flows to the top of the pilot piston, pushing the spool downward. Even though the air pressure on the top of the pilot piston and the bottom of the spool is the same, the pilot piston has a larger surface area, so the force on top is greater. This symbol on top shows that the valve is pilot operated. The spool is shifted by pilot air when the solenoid is actuated. When de-energized, the solenoid plunger returns to its default position, blocking the pilot air supply and opening a vent orifice on top. This allows the air pressure above the pilot piston to escape, and the combined force of the spring and the pilot air pressure under the spool pushes it back to the default state. The vented air then escapes through the holes in the solenoid cover. You might have noticed the manual override button on these directional control valves. When pressed, it lifts the solenoid plunger and activates the valve in the same way as when the solenoid is energized. That wraps up our explanation of the 5x2 directional control valve. It's just one of the many valves used in pneumatics, and we'll try to cover more in the upcoming videos. If you found this video helpful, like, share and subscribe, as it really helps the channel grow.